Oh God, the crocodile's got her! Somebody help! It's gonna rip her to pieces!
The scream echoed through the quiet compound, slicing through the early morning haze like a razor. Then came the sound, wet, violent, a splash, a thud, the low, guttural thrash of something heavy dragging something heavier through water. When one of the staff members rounded the corner, the sight nearly brought him to his knees. A woman's severed arm floated in a murky tank. The water, usually still and green, was tinted a reddish brown. Sloshing somewhere in the middle of the pool was a massive saltwater crocodile, its snout stained with blood, its jaws closing over something soft, something once human. And the woman, her name was Deasy Tuwo, 44 years old, a beloved biologist, brilliant, gentle, kind, now dead, killed by the very creature she had fed and cared for every single day. But to understand what really happened that morning, we have to go back to where it all began. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Animal Story for more real-life stories that shock, move, and make you question the bond between humans and animals. From heroic dogs to tragic encounters with wildlife, every story here has a lesson worth hearing. Hit that button and join the pack. Northern Sulawesi, Indonesia, a quiet province known for its mountains, coasts, and tight-knit communities. Hidden among the coconut groves and fishing villages sat a small marine research facility, privately owned, modestly funded, and mostly forgotten by the outside world. It was here that Deasy Tuwo spent nearly every day of her adult life. Not just working, but dedicating her soul. She wasn't famous. She didn't publish best-selling papers or speak at big conferences. But everyone in her circle knew Deasy was the heart of the operation. A quiet force of nature, calm, patient, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. She had no children, no spouse. Her coworkers became her family. And for reasons that baffled many, so did a 300-pound saltwater crocodile named Mary. Mary wasn't part of any official research program. He was just there, kept illegally in a large concrete tank behind the facility. 14 feet long, razorback ridges along his spine. A prehistoric gaze that made even the boldest volunteers keep their distance. But not Deasy. Every single morning did she prepared his food chunks of raw meat, fish heads, sometimes entire chickens, and carried them out to his tank alone. No gloves, no team, no safety rail, just her and the beast. Some of the younger techs had once joked, "She talks to it like it's her boyfriend." Another replied, "Nah, that's not a pet. That's a time bomb." But Deasy never laughed at those jokes. Instead, she said the same thing over and over. "I know him. He knows me. There's a mutual respect." And for years that seemed to be true. Mary never snapped at her, never lunged. He'd rise just high enough from the water to take the food gently from her hand. Sometimes he'd float motionless for hours as she sat nearby sketching or writing field notes. To outsiders, it was creepy. To Deasy, it was beautiful. She called him her silent friend. But a crocodile doesn't love. It waits. And in the early hours of January 10, 2019, after nearly 10 years of peaceful coexistence, Mary decided that respect was no longer enough. What happened next would leave an entire community horrified, a nation in disbelief, and animal behaviorists scrambling for answers. Because on that morning, the line between friend and predator vanished in a flash of teeth and blood. Her name didn't make headlines until after she died. But among those who knew her, Deasy Tuwo was unforgettable. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. You'd never find her dominating a room or drawing attention to herself. But put her in a lab coat, hand her a notebook, and let her stand beside a tank of marine life, and she lit up like a lighthouse. Born in a small coastal town in Indonesia, Deasy had always been drawn to the ocean. She grew up rescuing turtles stuck in plastic rings and sketching sea creatures from old biology books. By the time she reached college, marine biology wasn't just a dream. It was a promise she made to herself to live a life that protected the voiceless. And she kept that promise. After earning her degree, she joined a private marine research facility in Minahasa, North Sulawesi. It wasn't fancy, the budget was tight, equipment was secondhand, but the work mattered: breeding oysters, restoring coral beds, tracking fish populations. Deasy took it all in stride. She believed in small steps, quiet progress. To her, science wasn't about fame, it was about service. But even among her peers, there was one thing about her that raised eyebrows: her bond with Mary. Mary the saltwater crocodile. 14 feet of muscle and instinct. A relic of the dinosaur age with jaws strong enough to crush bone in a second. He wasn't part of any experiment. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Years before the Japanese owner of the facility, an elusive businessman named Ochiai brought the crocodile in under the radar. Nobody knew why. Maybe he thought it was cool. Maybe it was meant to be a private attraction. What was clear, though, was that it was dangerous and entirely illegal. Yet Deasy never saw Mary as a monster. Where others saw a threat, she saw a misunderstood creature. While others kept their distance, she brought food. While others whispered about the risk, she stayed late, making sure Mary had enough to eat, even speaking to him softly like he could understand. He's not violent, she once told a coworker. He's just well. There's a difference. She never used hooks or poles, never dropped food from afar. She stood right at the edge of the concrete tank and tossed raw meat in by hand. She even named him Mary, a word that sounded ironic to most, but to her it fit. Over time, that ritual became a rhythm. Morning coffee, lab notes, Mary's breakfast. It was strange, sure, but strangely comforting, like feeding a part of herself. To Deasy, Mary wasn't just a crocodile. He was something constant in a world where so much had slipped through her fingers. She never talked much about her family. Some said she lost her parents young. Others said she had a sister she hadn't seen in years. But what everyone knew was this: Deasy lived alone, worked alone, and gave everything she had to animals that couldn't speak for themselves. Maybe that's why Mary mattered so much. He never judged, never asked questions, never left. And slowly people stopped warning her. They figured if she had done it this long without a scratch, maybe she really did have some strange connection, some unspoken pact, a bond that only she and Mary understood. They were two solitary lives, one human, one beast sharing space on the edge of science and danger. A fragile trust built over years. But trust is a human concept, and Mary wasn't human. To the outside world, it looked impossible, maybe even insane. A 44-year-old marine biologist and a 300-pound saltwater crocodile sharing a quiet routine day after day like clockwork. No cage, no tranquilizers, just a woman and a reptile separated by a few feet of concrete. But inside the research center, people had stopped questioning it. It had become a kind of myth around the facility. Staff would whisper stories about how Mary would only eat when Deasy was around, how he'd float near the surface perfectly still until her voice broke the silence, how he'd blink slowly when she tossed in the meat as if acknowledging her. There was no science behind it, no study, just a feeling, a rhythm, something ancient and invisible. It's like watching someone feed a dragon, one technician once said. Another added, or like Beauty and the Beast, but she doesn't realize he's still the beast. They weren't wrong. But Deasy didn't care what people thought. In fact, she rarely spoke about it at all. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There were no YouTube videos, no viral TikToks. She wasn't building a brand or chasing views. In a world obsessed with attention, Deasy simply believed. And the strange thing was, it worked. For nearly a decade, not once did Mary show aggression. Not once did he lunge or snap or test his power. He'd glide across the water like a ghost rise, just enough to accept the food, then sink back into the murky stillness. It almost felt sacred. Some staff started calling her the Crocodile Whisperer. A few visitors even asked for photos. But Deasy always said no, he's not a pet. He's not for show, she told them. He's just a life, and I respect that. And deep down, it wasn't just about Mary. For Deasy, the crocodile was a kind of companion. Something steady, something unchanging in a world where everything else could fall apart. People came and went. Funding dried up. Friends moved on. But Mary stayed. Every morning, she greeted him like an old friend. Every evening before locking up, she checked his water, made sure he'd eaten. She even kept a small notebook private tucked in her desk drawer where she logged his moods, his feeding patterns, even sketches of him resting in the water. The pages were dated and filled with little comments in the margins. Calm today. Didn't blink until a second toss. Refused chicken. Waited until I sat down. Rainy morning, he seemed restless. If anyone else read it, they might have thought she was crazy. But to Deasy, it wasn't odd. It was communication. A kind of trust language built one quiet morning at a time. And as strange as it sounds, some part of her may have needed Mary just as much as he needed her. Maybe more. She never dated, never traveled. She'd turn down holidays, skip parties, and stay late at the lab. To some, it looked like isolation, but to her, it was purpose. In her mind, she wasn't alone because she had Mary. And no matter what people said, no matter how many red flags others saw in that concrete tank, Deasy never doubted the bond between them. She believed it was real, because it had been real for so long. But that's the thing about wild animals. They don't forget what they are. They just wait quietly until the moment they don't have to pretend anymore. At some point, the silence around the crocodile changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. There was no growl, no sudden bite. But those who paid attention could feel it, that something in Mary had started to shift. It began with the feeding. Normally, he'd rise just high enough to meet the food, eyes half-lidded, calm, deliberate. But then he started snapping, not at her, but at the air at the water. Hard and patient. The raw meat barely hit the surface before he lunged for it. The soft splash that once followed her feeding became a sudden crash. Then came the eyes. Mary's eyes had always been unnerving, those vertical pupils unblinking and ancient. But now they tracked her. Not like before. Not with recognition. With calculation. One of the junior staffers noticed it too. He's been watching her different lately, he said during lunch one day. Like waiting for something. Others began to get uneasy. A few stopped coming near the tank altogether. One young intern, brave enough to speak, his mind pulled Deasy aside. "I don't think it's safe anymore," he said. "He's getting aggressive. This could go bad fast." But Deasy didn't flinch. She gave him a soft smile, like a teacher calmly correcting a student. "Mary's just having a mood," she said. "He's a wild animal. They have cycles." The conversation ended there, and so did most of the warnings. People tried once, maybe twice, to tell her that something didn't feel right. But Deasy had a way of brushing it off with confidence, not arrogance. She truly believed she understood him, that their bond built on years of trust couldn't break. "He's never hurt me," she would say. "We have an understanding. I know him. I know him. But trust is a two-way street, and crocodiles don't drive." One afternoon, a visitor touring the facility happened to stop by Mary's tank. He'd heard rumors everyone had, and he was curious to see the domesticated dinosaur in person. As Deasy walked up with her feeding bucket, the man pulled out his phone to snap a photo, and just as she leaned over the edge to drop the meat, Mary surged forward, crashing against the side of the tank with terrifying force, a slap of muscle and water that sent a wave splashing over her shoes. The visitor jumped back, nearly dropping his phone. "Deasy," she laughed. A little nervously, maybe, but she laughed. "He's just being dramatic," she said. "He does that sometimes, tests the walls." But the walls weren't what Mary was testing. He was testing distance, timing, reaction. People who work with wild animals know the scariest ones aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who wait, the ones who study you while you think everything's fine. Still no report was filed, no barrier was built, no changes were made. Because at the end of the day, this was Deasy's domain. And she wasn't just the scientist, she was the only one who could go near Mary. To outsiders, that seemed impressive. To insiders, it felt like a ticking clock. But no one knew how fast the countdown was moving. And Deasy, she kept showing up every morning, kept walking to the edge of that tank like she always had, kept trusting that the creature waiting beneath the surface remembered all the years she'd fed him, talked to him, cared for him. She didn't see the danger growing behind those yellow eyes. Or maybe she just couldn't admit it. Because when you give your whole heart to something, it's hard to believe it could ever turn against you. But Mary wasn't a partner. He wasn't a friend. He was a predator with instincts as old as the earth itself. And soon, he would prove it. Thursday, January 10, 2019. The morning started like any other. The sun hung low behind a gray sky, casting a soft haze over the research center. A light drizzle had passed through before sunrise, leaving the walkway slick and the air heavy. The facility was quiet too early for the noise of machines or the buzz of staff chatter. Deasy Tuwo arrived just after 7:30 a.m., holding her usual bucket of food chunks of raw meat, chicken parts, and fish heads. Her boots tapped steadily across the wet cement. A journal was tucked under one arm. No one saw her smile, but those who knew her would assume she was. She always smiled on her way to feed Mary, No cameras captured what happened next. There were no screams heard in time, because the moment Mary struck it was fast, brutal, and utterly silent, like a switch had been flipped in the dark. Authorities later pieced it together from what little evidence was left. Deasy had approached the edge of the tank just like she always did. No hesitation, no fear. She may have even spoken to him as she often did, that soft voice she reserved just for Mary. Perhaps she leaned over slightly, tossing the first slab of meat into the water. And that's when he leapt. Witnesses later described it as inhuman, a near vertical launch from a beast weighing nearly 300 pounds. He surged out of the water over 5 feet, jaws wide, and snatched her by the torso. She didn't have time to scream. She didn't have time to fight. Mary dragged her into the tank in one violent motion, water crashing around them like thunder. Then came the death roll, an instinctive, horrifying twist that crocodiles use to shred flesh from bone. Her body thrashed against the concrete as blood clouded the water, a deep crimson bloom in a pool that had once been quiet. It was over in seconds. The first person to notice something was wrong was a junior technician. He realized Deasy was late returning from feeding duty, a detail that wouldn't usually raise alarm, except she was never late, not even once. He walked toward the tank, calling her name. What he saw stopped him cold. Floating in the murky water was a severed arm, just an arm. The rest of her was beneath the surface, hidden beneath Mary's massive frame. He ran, shouting, screaming. By the time help arrived, it was too late. When police and wildlife officials finally recovered what they could, they found what was left of Deasy's body lodged in Mary's enclosure, her upper half torn apart, her lower half missing. Her torso had deep bite wounds. Her spine had been fractured from the force of the roll. There was no chance she could have survived the first bite. The center went into lockdown. Authorities tranquilized Mary with the help of a local wildlife unit. It took nearly a dozen people to sedate him and haul him into a reinforced truck. He didn't fight. He didn't thrash. He simply lay still, calm, almost like he had finally gotten what he'd been waiting for all along. News spread quickly. A woman killed by the very crocodile she'd cared for every day for 10 years. People across the country were stunned. Animal experts weighed in on morning shows. Comment sections exploded. How could this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? But those who knew Deasy weren't surprised by the bond, only by how it ended. Some cried, some were angry, others whispered what no one wanted to say out loud. She trusted him too much. And the very thing that made her special, her gentleness, her belief in the goodness of nature, was what ultimately got her killed. The world didn't know Deasy Tuwo until the day she died. And when they finally did, it was through headlines like "Woman Killed by Pet Crocodile, Researcher Mauled in Croc Attack." She fed him for years. Then he ate her. But that's not who she was. To those who worked beside her, Deasy wasn't just the woman with the crocodile. She was the quiet soul who stayed late to organize lab samples, the gentle voice who calmed interns through their first dive, the soft smile that made you feel seen in a place built for numbers and data. She was the kind of person who believed that even the most feared animals deserve compassion. And in the end, that belief may have cost her everything. After her death, Mary was transported under heavy sedation to a wildlife conservation facility. There he was kept in isolation while the government debated what to do with him. Many called for him to be euthanized. Others demanded better protections for workers in facilities like Deasy's. But one thing was certain: he should never have been there in the first place. Mary had been kept illegally. There were no safety protocols, no permits, no proper enclosures. And the man who had brought him to the facility, Ochiai, the Japanese national who owned the center, vanished, fled the country within days of the incident. Authorities never caught him, so there was no one left to answer for what happened. No one to apologize. No one to explain why a massive predator had been left in the care of a woman with no protection, no backup, and no support. It didn't take long for the story to become something else. Online people debated whether Deasy was a martyr or a fool. Some blamed her for getting too close. Others blamed the system for letting it happen. A few defended the crocodile, arguing that it was only following instinct. But for those who knew her, none of that mattered, because they knew Deasy never treated Mary like a monster. She treated him like a creature worthy of love. And maybe that's the tragedy. She gave him kindness, patience, 10 years of care. And in return, he did what predators do when the line between safety and instinct disappears. He attacked. Because wild is still wild, even when it wears a quiet face. The facility shut down shortly after. Her desk was left untouched for weeks. A single orchid sat wilting on the windowsill. Her notebook filled with sketches and feeding notes was boxed up by a friend and sent to her only living relative, a cousin across the country. And Mary, he now lives behind reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. No contact, no feeding rituals, no names, just a number on a chart and a warning on the gate, do not approach. In the end, what's left is the silence, the empty walkway where she once stood, the echo of a bond that was never mutual. The haunting truth that sometimes love isn't enough to tame nature. So now we ask you, do you believe love can override instinct, or are we dangerously humanizing animals that were never meant to be tamed? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think twice about what it means to trust the untamable, subscribe to Animal Story for more true stories that challenge what we believe about the creatures we live with. Because sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that start with love.